Hey all, it's Matt, your average gamer. Today we've got a really cool Fire and Faith build using the Cranial Vessel Candlestand. This is a solid one for damage, especially on larger targets. We're going to be doing some PvE and some PvP for the first time later too, so be sure to stick around for that. Before we continue though, I'd like to give a shout out to ExpressVPN, the awesome VPN service I've been using lately. It's a safe and secure way to browse. There's a discount link in the description below, along with 3 extra months free. This build has my 2 favorite damage types, Strength and Faith. Its Ash of War, Surge of Faith, does mostly if not all fire damage and scales mainly with your Faith stat. You raise the candlestand up in the air and you get substantial fire damage as you go through 2 parts of the Ash, the first surge and the second. Does a total of around 50 poise damage, but that's mostly good for larger targets because they're getting hit with all of it. For smaller targets, you may find it a little bit tricky to land, although the initial explosion from this unique Ash of War does damage to any targets near you. You'll see when I do PvP later in the video that it's actually quite good because of the initial damage you get for all size targets when activating the Ash of War. Placidusax here is a larger target, so he's going to take more damage from a weapon like this. Because the spread is so big, and it mostly does better damage to bigger targets, Placidusax will end up falling victim to this, and this did take a few tries to get used to the Ash of War as it's a bit slow, but it does a lot of fire damage. If you're into Fire and Faith builds, this is definitely something you have to try out. If you haven't tried the Cranial Vessel Candlestand, now's the time to give it a try. You can mix it in with a ton of different Faith builds in terms of like incantations and things you want to throw in. For the purpose of this video, we're going to focus just on the Candlestand, but you have a lot of variety with a build like this one. And that's the main thing we're looking for right now, is we're looking for variety. A lot of us are looking for ways to keep the game interesting. I recently posted my video on when I expect DLC to come out, which is probably around early to mid 2024. So at this point in time, if you're still playing Elden Ring, you're always going to be looking for ways to keep the game more fun. And I think using obscure weapons like the Candlestand is a great way to do that. By the way, I'm going to continue to cover Elden Ring because I love the game. It's probably my favorite game of all time, but I am probably going to cover Armored Core when it comes out too, assuming it ends up being quite good. But anyway, back to the build here and on to Placidusax as we deal with the second phase, which can be a little bit tough. When dealing with phase 2 of Placidusax, the best bet here is to do as much damage as you can near his tail, which is almost like a safe point for a lot of the fight. Although some of the fire can hit you, most of his attacks aren't going to do that. And then when it comes to the beams, which is probably the hardest part to deal with, I just close the distance as fast as I can and try to get behind him. And that's your best bet because these beams are really difficult to deal with. They can one-shot you at 60 vigor, they can one-shot you in a lot of circumstances. So if you don't want to have to deal with them, try to close the distance on him, see if you can get some hits behind him, some poise damage. You're safe behind him. Eventually they'll shoot the beams in the air and you'll have even more time to attack him. And in most cases he's going to go down shortly after that anyway because of the fact that by the time he does the beams, in most cases, again this is the majority of the time, he's going to have around like 20% of his HP. So at that point, continue to go behind him. We're using the Candlestand, so we're just going to continue to do that massive fire damage and eventually take down Placidusax on New Game +7. After a handful of tries, it wasn't too bad, and down he goes. Where do you get the Cranial Vessel Candlestand? You get it at the Giant Conquering Hero's Grave in Mountaintops of the Giants. I'll show it on the map at the end. It's the second door that's locked behind a stone sword key, and is easy to get to once you're inside. It's above the first fire pillar. Be warned though, as there's a lot of enemies that are going to follow you from room to room. In order to dispose of them, you'll have to bring them, the clear looking enemies at least, into the light symbol on the ground and attack them from there. For me, I just ended up getting followed like crazy. Good times. Yeah, the enemies here can be a little bit difficult and they could be a little bit cumbersome. There's a lot of them. They're going to follow you, and I did end up getting killed at the end. I didn't include it in this clip after I ran all the way out. It ended up being a quicker way to get out of the dungeon anyway, but let's show it on the map here and get into those details. Here's the dungeon, and there it is on the map. You can easily get here from the Giant's Grave site of Grace, going right instead of forward and following the path around until you reach the dungeon. This is a really fun weapon and certainly worth the grab. The Giant Seal, by the way, is also in this dungeon too, so be sure to grab that as well, as it boosts your fire incantations and is a really awesome seal to have. For tree avatars and certain enemies that are weak to fire, this is especially good against them. The Candlestand absolutely crushes in these situations. Use it up close for massive fire damage, and these types of enemies won't be a threat to you. It's also solid to practice on these guys. Since they're slow and the Ash is a bit slow as well, it's a good chance to check it out while doing a crazy amount of fire damage, especially this tree avatar who you can just walk up behind, but mainly the Ash of War is kind of slow, so against slower, bigger targets that are weak to fire, it's especially good. And down goes the tree avatar. That wasn't too hard, and we're on to dragons, which also take solid damage from this, not just Placidusax. The dragon here at Liurny of the Lakes absolutely gets demolished by the amount of fire damage we're able to do, and this fight ends up being very quick. It can blow up for immense damage, literally immense fire damage right away, and then follow up with the two surges that continue to do more and more fire damage, especially to bigger targets. You can absolutely shred them with the Cranial Vessel Candlestand. It is fantastic for those big targets in Elden Ring. Next up is going to be the Gargoyle that we're going to take on in Kayla to try a little bit of a different target. Still kind of a big hitbox, but reasonably still a little bit more of a challenge. And he ends up being a little bit trickier as he was fairly mobile and continued to move around frequently. Even so, the damage is really good on the Cranial Candlestand, and he fell victim to the power of it in the end because the Ash of War is quite good. It really is something that you could use for a lot of the bosses in the game. It does poise damage, massive fire damage, and it scales really well with your Faith stat. And a lot of weapons in Elden Ring do take a little bit to get used to, so this is no exception. You're going to practice this, you're going to get better at it, and if you're a Faith and Strength build, you have a lot at your disposal anyway. The combination is really quite good, and it's something once you get down, you're going to be able to use this Ash of War to just crush a ton of bosses in the game. It's not too hard to get used to, and again, it's a little bit slow. It's kind of like the Mogwin Sacred Spear Faith version. Doesn't have quite the bleed power that has, obviously, because we're not doing bleed, but it does a lot of damage and it's quite impressive, and it is very much the same standing target type of deal, but the damage output you're getting is quite good. NPC invaders were up next, so I'm just going to show one before we get into PvP for a minute. The explosion does a lot of damage and knockback initially. Time it right while baiting them and they'll go down extremely quickly. Next up, we'll be doing some PvP. This is the first time I've done PvP in months, so we're going to get into those details now. It was really fun, by the way, jumping back into PvP. Alright, let's get into some matches. For PvP, which I haven't done since December, I did around 8 matches and won 5 in total. The Candlestand wasn't bad, and I was able to bait and then use the initial contact damage to win some matches. The knockback is also great and seems to knock back anyone, especially since the poise nerf in 1.10. The poise obviously changed for a lot for PvP in 1.10. Everybody's kind of talking about that right now. PvP ended up being a lot of fun, and I'm glad I tried it out for a little bit for this build for the first time in a long time. If you'd like to see more PvP content, be sure to let me know in the comments below, because honestly I ended up having a really good time. It was fun using an odd weapon too, instead of hopping around with whatever meta bleed build is currently going around. PvP wasn't really bad at all. Yeah, taking on some people online in PvP ended up being something that I definitely enjoyed. It was kind of unique using something like this too, where you can kind of bait them and then they'd come towards you and then you could use the Ash of War, and the explosion, that initial explosion damage was just ridiculous. In most cases it did most of their health bar, and in some cases, I think in the one clip, it even one-shot the guy. So yeah, maybe this isn't the best PvP weapon in Elden Ring. I don't really know a lot about PvP currently, but for me, it did the job fine. It did enough, it did enough damage, and I had a good time with it. So if you're looking to do PvP, apparently the Cranial Vessel Candlestand, not a bad weapon at all. Now on to mobs. Mobs are easy with this, as you'll crush them with the initial hit and then they'll be gone shortly after. This is a powerful one for groups of enemies, and Gatefront isn't a bad place to start. Try this out for the first time. By the way, if you're not subbed and you've been following to this point, sub to this channel. We'll continue to do awesome Elden Ring builds and content, and possibly even Armored Core 6, assuming it ends up being as good as it looks and lives up to the hype. It is from software though, and much like Elden Ring, it probably will live up to the hype. I am looking forward to that. I'm definitely looking forward to Armored Core 6, and I'm looking forward to continuing to cover Elden Ring in the meantime, even though DLC does feel further out than we initially expected. Again, I mentioned that earlier at the video, probably early to mid 2024 at this point in time. Let's get into buffs, builds, stats, everything you need to know. For buffs, we're going to drink our tier because we're going to go with the longer duration stuff first, and the fire tier is great with this build. Then we're going to use Golden Vow, Blessings Boon, or Blessing of the Erd Tree, Howl of Shabriri, although if you're using physical damage and hitting with the weapon, Flame Grammy Strength is really good too. And then we're going to fill up our FB. Then we get to use that awesome Surge of Faith, Ash of War, which does a ton of fire damage. It's a really awesome weapon. You can do charged attacks for a lot of damage and jump attacks too. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Cranial Vessel Candlestand plus 10 preferably. Scales with a B in Strength and Faith. Any seals will do. The Giant Seal goes well with this build though. Shard of Alexander, Fire Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, Dragoncrest Greatshield Talisman. The Faith tier is really good with this, or the Defense tier. And then the Fire tier, let's get into stats for this one. So for stats, it's a Strength and Faith build, but the Ash of War seems to lean heavily towards your Faith stat, so I went for a heavy investment with Faith and just 30 Strength. But since we're two-handing it, we're going to end up with 45 Strength anyway. But if you wanted to move the stats around, you could do something like 40 Strength and 50 Faith maybe, something like that. 40 Strength would get you to 60 if you two-hand with the bonus, but for me, I'm using the Ash of War a lot, so this is what I ended up deciding on. By the way, this was the first one that was recorded on my PC, well edited on my PC, and it took a lot to get used to. I'm still learning the programs and stuff. I hope you guys end up liking this one. I hope it came out quality enough. And if you're not subbed, definitely be sure to sub. You're not going to want to miss out. The Discord, by the way, is also in the description below, so be sure to join that too. Thanks for watching.